In this video, we will continue our discussion about basic UI elements and their attributes. For that, I'm going to switch to this text view. First of all, let's delete this pre-built text. And as before, let's change this constraint layout to relative layout. We will talk about what constraint layout is. In here, I'm going to start with talking about edit text. We have seen edit text in our beginning videos when we created our first application, but in this video we will expand our knowledge on edit text. For width, I'm going to stay with match parent, and for height, let's say wrap content. Let's also click on this preview to see a preview of what we are doing. Let's give it a text by typing text. I'm going to say hello, or let's say name. I don't like it to be this top in here, so let's give it a margin. Or similarly, I can come to this relative layout tag, this opening relative layout tag, and give it an attribute of padding. Padding and margin are very similar to each other, but there are some differences. Margin is from outside the element. For example, if I gave this edit text a margin, it will keep its distance from other elements from outer layer, but if I give for example this relative layout a padding, it will give distance from inside. As you can see in here, there are a little bit difference for padding and margin, but you can use whatever you want. Now that I'm giving my relative layout, my parent layout, a padding of 20 dp, all my elements inside this relative layout will keep their distance to 20 dp from each side of this relative layout. Okay, let's continue with this edit text. I can give it an ID. I'm going to call it edit text. Also, I can define an input type for our edit text. For example, I can make my user to enter only the numbers, or maybe a date, or also maybe some password. For example, let's say password, and in here I have two options, number password and text password. It's self-explanatory, and if we choose text password, user can enter anything, but in here you can see it's four dots instead of this name text. In here I'm just going to say text, means that user can enter anything. There are some other attributes to edit text as well, and if we come to this design mode in here, we can see some of those attributes, and let's talk about some of the interesting ones. For example, this hint in here, you know what hint is. For example, let's give it a hint of name, and let's delete this text in here. Now if the user tries to type something, this name will disappear. It means that we are giving some hint to the user. Also, this text size in here, which we can change the size of our text from here, or this text color, which we can click in these three dots, which is very small, and can change the color of our text. For example, let's choose this one. Also, we can give our text some styles like bold, italic, or all capitals. We can give it an alignment, which we can say from right to left, in center, or whatever. There are a lot of them in here as well. You can see them for yourself, but in most of the case you won't be using all of these. You probably will work in 90% of the times with just these few attributes. Okay, we know how to define this edit text in our Java code. I'm going to define all my UI elements in the fields from now. Let's say edit text. Let's call it edit text. Notice that I shouldn't define or initialize my elements in these fields because it's not a part of life cycle of activity. Here is the first part that will be run when our activity is created. We will talk about activity life cycle. For now, let's just continue our talk. We will cast it to an edit text, find d by id r.id dot text edit text. Now, if we want to get the text of our edit text, we can simply say edit text dot get text. Also, we need to do another level of conversion in here, which we do by typing dot to string. It's not important what it really is doing. It's converting whatever the result of this get text is to a string, to a text that we can use in our code. But notice that this is not a good place to get the text of our edit text because we are in this onCreate method, which is only the method that we run when we create our activity, or because in this case we have only one activity when we run our application. And the initial text of our edit text is nothing in here. We just have a hint. And this edit text.getText.toString is nothing as well. For example, if we want to save it to something, to some string, let's say text is equal to edit text.getText.toString, this text will be empty. It won't be null, but it will be empty. This is not a good place. We should get the text of our edit text in some onClick method of some button or something, but we are not going to do that in this video. Later on maybe. The next element we are going to define is a checkbox. Let's create our checkbox. Wrap content and wrap content for the height and width. Let's give it an ID. I'm going to call it checkbox. The text, let's say discount, for example, if you are shopping from an online store or something. Let's drag it below our edit text at ID edit text. Let's give it a margin top of 10 dp. Also, we can change its default value by saying check, and by determining its value to true or false. We can check it, or we can uncheck it by giving it false. We can similarly define this edit text in our Java code. Let's quickly type it. We'll cast it to checkbox. Now we can get its value and check if it's checked or unchecked by saying checkbox dot is checked, and it will return a boolean value, a true false value. For example, we can say if checkbox that is checked, let's print something. Let's say it is checked, and also if not, let's simply print it's not checked. We can run our program in here. It might take some time, so I'll skip the running process. Now if we look at our run window in here, we should see in here that it's not checked because we initially didn't check it, and no matter what, no matter if I check or uncheck it, it won't make any difference because as I mentioned before, this is not a good place to get the values of our items in this onCreate method. We should do it in some onClick method of some button or something, because as I mentioned before, this is not a good place to get the values of our elements, because this onCreate method will only be run when we initially run our application, or to be specific, when we create our activity. For example, let's create a button in here. Let's give it a text. I'm going to say start, give it an ID, btn start, and below our checkbox. Okay, now in here let's define our button as well. Private button, private button, btn start. Let's say btn start is equal to, let's cast it to button. Let's give our button an onClick attribute as well. There are some other ways to define an onClick listener for our buttons. We will talk about the other ways, but for now the simplest way is to give it an attribute. Let's say start. Let's copy it and let's create our method. For example, we can get the value of our checkbox from inside this btn start onClick attribute. But notice that there are some potential bugs in here. For example, we haven't initialized our checkbox yet, but we are defining our button. Means that if we have a button and it's onClick listener or onClick attribute, inside this onClick attribute, because we are using this checkbox haven't been initialized yet and can be null. So it can be problematic, so I prefer to define it before this button. Okay, now let's run our program. Let's click on this run in here and let's check the differences. For example, when I click this, if I come to the bottom of it and if I click on this start, you can see that it's checked. If we uncheck it and click on this start, it's not checked. It's getting its value when we click on this button. Also, we can set the value of our checkbox from here as well. For example, let's say checkbox.setChecked, and we need to pass a boolean in here, true or false value. The next element that we are going to talk about are radio button and radio groups. Let's type them, let's define one, and we'll see what those are. For that, I'm going to simply say radio button, wrap content, and set a text for it. Let's say mail in here. Let's make it come below our button, and as you can see, it's just a circle, and we can select or deselect it. But if we want to have a radio group, means that we have some options that we can choose only one of them. Let's define our radio group, wrap content. Inside this radio group, we will define our radio buttons. Let's say radio button, wrap content, text, let's say mail, ID, radio button, mail, another radio button, text, let's say female, an ID of radio button female, another radio button, let's say for the text other, and for the ID radio button other. We can move this radio group to the bottom of this start so we can see all of these. Let's say below our BTN start. Also margin swap for 1080p. But I don't like that these are vertical. I want them to be horizontal. For that, in this radio group, I can give it an orientation attribute and set it to horizontal. As simple as that. Also, if I want to check some default value in here, I can select which of these radio buttons that I want. For example, let's check mail as default. I can say checked to true. It's checked attribute to true. The difference between a radio group and a checkbox is that when you define a radio group, you only can select one of them, but for example, if we have multiple checkboxes, we can check or uncheck all of them, no matter what. Now let's define our radio group in here as well. Let's say private radio group. Let's call it radio group. And in here, as always, radio group find view by ID or that ID dot. What was it? ID. I don't think I gave it an ID. Let's see. Yes, we don't have an ID in here. Now, if we want to get the value of our radio group or to see which one of the radio buttons is checked, for example, in this onClick attribute or onClick method of our button, we can say radio group dot get checked radio button ID, which will get the ID. We can save it into an integer. Let's save it to an integer called ID, and depending on that we will act. For example, let's create a switch statement which will act depending on that ID. For example, or in case it's r.id dot radio button mail, for example. What am I doing in here? I'm getting the ID of the checked radio button of our radio group and comparing it with different IDs. For example, r.id dot radio button mail, which is the address of this mail radio button in here, for example. I can say I can change the text of our edit text to something. For example, let's say edit text dot set text to mail. In case it's r.id dot radio button female. Let's say edit text dot set text to female. And in case it's r.id dot other, let's say edit text dot set text to other, and let's add a break and a default. Now if we run our program, if I click on this start, I see that the text of our edit text changed to mail. If I select other, for example, it will change it to other. Let's talk about another element and finish off this video after that. For that, I'm going to create a progress bar, which we can define like this. Progress bar. For the width, this time I'm going to choose match parent, and for the height, wrap content. I don't like it to be circular like this. I want it to be linear. You can say style and horizontal for that. This second one, appcompat progress bar dot horizontal. Let's move it below our radio group. And for visibility purposes, let's give it an progress so we know that what we are talking about. For example, 20%. Let's give it a maximum ID of 100%. I don't think anything else is necessary. Let's give it a margin as well. Margin top of 20 dB. This progress bar will be useful when we are, for example, downloading something or doing some heavy process. We will update our progress bar from here. For example, let's create a thread in here. Before that, let's access to our progress bar in here. Progress bar, let's call it progress bar. I don't think I gave it an ID. No, it doesn't have an ID. Let's copy it from here. Now let's create our thread. We know how to create a thread from our Java session. New thread, we need to pass a new runnable, which I can type new runnable and it will generate this run method for us. First, I will end this sentence with a semicolon in here. Next, we'll create a for loop. And I is equal to 0, I less than 10, and I plus plus. Let's increment the progress of our progress bar, increment progress by. We can define a percentage in here, and we will say how much progress do we want for each time that we are looping. After that, we will freeze our thread or sleep our thread for 1 second. And as you know from before, we need to surround this sleep with a try catch because anything else don't interrupt our thread. The last thing we need to do is to start our thread. Let's start it by thread.start. Now if we run our program, we can see that our progress bar is updating. Okay, this video is getting long. In the next video, we will continue our talk about some other UI elements and also those constraint, relative, and linear layouts that I talked about. So see you in the next video.